Hello, thank you everyone. Thanks for coming. I don't know how I showed up on the radar of the organizers, but I'm very happy I did. And thanks for having me here. And I'll have to figure this out. So I want to start because
right on the other side of the
whoa. This should maybe. So I want to start with a movie, which is infinitely more entertaining than my presentation. But I don't know how I can start it at the beginning.
Two towns right on the other side of the wall, boy.
You see, Mr. Valiant, the successful conclusion of the case draws a curtain for my career as a jurist in Toontown. I'm retiring to take a new role in the private sector.
I won't be Cloverleaf Industries by any chance, huh?
You're looking at the sole stockholder.
Benny, you go to the cops. I'm gonna save my wife.
Be careful with that gun. This ain't no cartoon, you know. This is no way to make a living.
Wouldn't you know? La.
Oh, okay, good. I was hoping I was trying to stop that. The thing was a little miscued, but it's from a movie called Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and it is a movie that gives credence to a conspiracy theory that I subscribe to completely, which is that Detroit, in a very organized way, at the peak of its powers, very deliberately deconstructed public transportation, which there was plentiful supply of in this country. And the fact that there is an sort of an automobile dependency is not entirely an accident. It's not. This is not natural habitat for America, but has happened as a consequence of deliberate actions. Anyway, that's what the movie clip was about. But let me get into the sort of heart of the presentation right now. I start with this picture, which looks almost like a Japanese or a Chinese miniature painting. It's quite beautiful, actually. But it's the final station, Montauk, on the Long Island Railroad line. And if you look carefully in the water, there's water on both sides of the platform, and you can actually barely see the rail. The point being that climate change is happening, and infrastructure that was designed to be dry and designed to function as a rail yard is now often a place where the sea comes quite often in many ways. Okay, so what is next generation infrastructure? I think next generation infrastructure is smart. And I come from the world of mobility. So what is smart mobility? It is sustainable for both the planet and for the people. It is resilient, and it leverages information. And my presentation will be kind of, this is that agenda slide that people have and say what their presentation is going to be about. So this is kind of what I'm going to speak about for the next 15, 20 minutes. Again, some distortion of slides, of fonts, but anyway, this is, for those of you who can't read it, it says energy consumption and sustainability macro view. I think all my fonts have kind of run away. But anyway, I will try to speak on top of that. Basically, what's going on here is this is a slide of the energy consumption of 4 different countries: India, China, Germany, and the US. And if I can get a laser pointer to work. The orange, or that dark yellow, which says 12% and 10% for India and China, 27% and 40% for Germany and US, that's transportation energy. Now, we don't know what the absolute numbers are, but this is relative to the rest of the energy consumption in these countries. It's the developing world takes about 1/10 of all its energy to get around from A to B, people and goods. And Germany, which is kind of typical of most of the Western world, if this was the UK or Japan, that number would be closer to 20%, spends between 1/5 and 1/4 of its energy to transport itself. And the US spends, now this is slightly old, now the number is more like 43%. Now, when I say energy, there is a distinction to be made, which is I am giving you the aggregate of tailpipe, which is whatever the vehicle is burning and combusting, and also the combustion that happens at the stage of refining and a little bit in transportation. So this is kind of a wells to wheels aggregate. The EPA actually does not report it as such. It reports the refining in under a different heading of industrial, which I think that I have a problem with that, but we can discuss that later. But this is an aggregate. There are people who look at it in this way. And if you looked at the aggregate, then transportation in the US is more than 40% of all energy consumption. And as such is the largest consumer of energy. It is not electrical power generation, which is mistakenly thought of as the largest, only because, as I said, transportation is usually disaggregated between refining and internal combustion and engine. Now let's do some absolute numbers. So remember India, China, I have also Germany and the US, and I've also thrown Japan into this. These are in MBTUs, which is millions of British thermal units. It's a unit of energy that the British don't use anymore, but the US continues to. There's a full, I'm sure, day's conference in discussing that, but I will not go into it. Think of it as bags of Rice Krispies. It doesn't matter. It's a comparative scale. India is at 23 per capita per annum. China is 3 times that at 72. Japan is 154. This is all, and Germany is very close to Japan. So that's kind of the number that most of the OECD is at, about 150 million BTUs per capita per annum. And the US is almost double that. Now, if you looked at India and China, you would say, of course, as you develop, you consume more energy per person. But Germany, interestingly, and Japan, has higher development indices than America. They, on average, live longer, infant mortality is lower, whatever constitutes development, they are further along. Yet, they do so only on half the energy per person per annum than we do. So what it really comes down to is lifestyle. It's not about anything else, and a lot of this lifestyle is related to transportation and land use, and I'll get to that. Now, the national average for the US was 285 million BTUs per capita per annum. These are the 3 most populous states, New York, California, and Texas. So let's see what they have on average. So New York is 185. Remember, Germany was 159. So New York is pretty close to a European number, actually, per capita per annum. California is 209 million BTUs per capita per annum. But remember, the national average was 285. So someone's got to do the hard work. Texas is close to 500 million BTUs per capita per annum. Need to say anything else? The 5 boroughs of New York City are half the German number. So there's nothing congenital about this. It's not that it comes with birth. It is how you live, the land use, and the lifestyle that encourages or discourages the use of energy. And Americans actually, in the right land use transportation setting, can live quite frugally with very little energy. By the way, that 88.5 to the 285 number is a very interesting correlation. It's roughly about a quarter to 3/4. So if you think that the Kyoto Protocol is right, that we all have to be at about a quarter of our per capita energy or emissions by 2050, New York City is already achieved America's Kyoto standard. And it's not a small city. It's 10 million people, and if it were a state, it would rank amongst the top 10, top 11 states in population by economy. It's a very large. It's, I think, the 4th or the 5th largest economy. So if so many people can live like that, you can, if you set the right set of circumstances up, have many, many more people living like that. Anyway. So now I want to do the same comparison, but not from a macro, but a micro. So from the ground up rather than from the air. So I'm looking at 1 square foot of identical commercial space. One of them is in Midtown Manhattan, and the other one is in Albany. They're identical in every way. Their specs, their HVAC, everything is the same. The only difference is in the Albany building, almost everyone, virtually everyone, drives to work in a single occupancy car. And in the Manhattan building, the opposite is true. Almost no one drives to work. So a mechanical engineering colleague of mine called Dan Knoll and I, we ran this free DOE software called eQuest. I think it's now defunct, but there you see the 2 buildings. This is screen grabs and so this is what the 2 buildings consume on a per capita, on a per square foot basis. The yellow is light, the green is HVAC, the blue is elevators and escalators. It's a little bit more in the low-rise suburban because it has more cores. But this is dwarfed once you add the transportation component to it. And again, normalized to that same per square foot basis. And there are assumptions made about the number of working days, the trip lengths, and actually this is somewhat unfair to the public transportation scenario because it's taking a diesel bus doing 4 miles per gallon with 20 people on board. If this were an electricity run, if this was a subway, for instance, in rush hour in the morning, that red on the left would be even half of itself. So you're all familiar with LEED, BREEAM, etc., correct? LEED's entire focus is on the bottom, and turns out the action is on the top. So if you built a LEED Platinum building that everyone drives a car to, you're wasting your time. You may as well go home. There's nothing that you can achieve doing that. Unbeknownst to Dan and myself, there were other people doing a very similar analysis, except they were normalizing it to per user rather than per square foot. But the result is amazingly and uncannily similar. The blue is the embodied energy, the yellow is the operating, the mustard, whatever, is the operating agency, and the red is transportation. Okay, so now I want to dwell for very, very quickly for 2 slides on taking the car out of carbon versus taking the carbon out of the car. So there is this notion that, efficiency, engine efficiency will save the day, or electrification will save the day, etc. Now, I do that in sort of an allegorical way. I look at it. So here is a map of the US, and it says what, and this is the last time that gas hit $4 a gallon, but at a very high gas cost. So it asks the question, what fraction of the household income is being spent on gas? And gray is low, and sort of yellow and brown, mustard, whatever is high. And if you looked at this map, and this is a county by county analysis, if you looked at this map, you could have a denominator-based conclusion or a numerator-based conclusion. You could either conclude that people on the coast make more money because it's a fraction of the household income. And if you made that conclusion, you would be right. People on the coast do make more money, so the larger denominator. Or you could conclude that gas prices are more expensive in the hinterland. So that's why people are paying more of the household income on it. If you concluded the second thing, you would be dead wrong. This is the price of gas, again on a county by county basis, so actually the blue is the lowest and that yellow is the highest. In other words, people with the cheapest gas are spending the highest fraction of their income. Now, what is cheapest gas? On a per mile basis, all things being equal, doubling the efficiency of the engine is the same as halving the price of gas. So in other words, the people in the middle have, quote unquote, the most efficient engine. And yet they're spending more money doing this. This is should not come as a surprise. It's called the rebound effect. This has happened with internet usage. This has happened with many, many things. As you make something more efficient, people use more of it. So if you really wanted to stop, energy waste or emissions from internal combustion engines, you should be in the business of designing the least efficient engine, not the most efficient one. Because again, it's completely counterproductive. Okay, so this was nothing like this in the afternoon to wake everyone up. This was the clip that, the piece that I wanted to show. This is from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And this movie was set where that line is in 1949 or so, right after the Second World War. The 2 lines that you see there are VMT, vehicle miles traveled. One of them is in absolute numbers, the blue one, and the orange line is per capita. So per capita has actually grown even faster, makes sense. It's been faster than population growth. So that's the setting of the movie. The box that I just made is basically when the movie was made, which was in the late 80s. And of course, it projects to about 10 years ago. So look at that green box that I created and the geometry of the 2 curves. And that is more or less or very, very similar to the obesity geometry. This is a map of the US from 1990 with states less than 10%. This is CDC definition. and between 10 and 15%, and more or less that covers the whole country. This is the same map 10 years later, 1999. This is the same map in 2008. And I think I have one more. This is the most recent map. It's an epidemic. This is a great infographic that I love because it correlates these issues very, very well. It basically says in which state is walking, biking, and public transportation, availability and use, and then the BMI charted next to it. And as you would guess, it's absolutely bang on a inverse correlation. So states that have good public transportation. Public transportation, by the way, is the underpinning for walking and biking. You cannot walk or bike in Dallas as a practical means of getting around. You can only do it in denser places because public transportation sets up the right sort of rubric. This is that same thing sort of projected internationally. And this is an interesting graph, and I like it because Europeans actually, this has nothing to do with vehicle ownership. So Europeans actually own more cars or more automobiles on a per driving age adult basis than Americans. They just don't drive them as much. And this is an important distinction to make because as India and China kind of come online, having a car is a symbol of having arrived. It's a symbol of some kind of achievement. If you think that the best use of a car is to bring it out on a Saturday or a Sunday afternoon and wash it in front of you in the full view of your neighborhood, that's a very good use for a car. You just ought not to be driving it. And clearly there are people doing, the Germans are doing that. Some big banker who makes a lot of money probably has a 7 Series BMW in his driveway, but walks to his Bahnhof and takes the train and goes to work. And that's the model that we have to figure out how to get. So this is it again. Philosophers on the streets. But then one has to be careful about the good thing not becoming an elitist thing, about bike share not sort of being all about beautiful people and beautiful imagery, and then when things go wrong and the sort of the underclass really resents you, they resent the bikes. That's what they're vandalizing, because there's Velib, which is kind of now I guess the parent of many systems, including New York's. This is still something that wealthy people in a very small part of the city use and can use. Whereas on the other hand, this is in Guangzhou, and the world's largest bike share system is in a place called Hangzhou. It's very cheap and cheerful bikes that if you wanted to steal or if you wanted to run your car over, feel free to. They don't care. There are 80,000 of them. They will keep replenishing the bikes pretty inexpensively. And indeed, philosophically, this is the true legacy of Amsterdam. When the first bike share started, it was plentiful, it was cheap, it was for you to kind of do whatever you wanted. If you wanted to graffiti your name on it, no problem. And now I think there are some interesting models that are emerging, even that sort of triangulate that space. This is something called Social Bike, SoBike, and they are in Hoboken, right across the water from us. These things don't need a tether. They don't need a place to come and park, which is often an issue because you know how peak loading works. In the morning, everybody wants to go from east to west. In the afternoon, everybody wants to come from west to east. So these things actually, they don't need it. You can tie them next to the tree. You can put it onto any railing, etc. The thing at the back speaks to the satellite, and your phone tells you. It's much like a car-to-go kind of thing. And so there are models now that are exploring this business of being plentifully available. I was on a TCRP trip. This is a bunch of Americans obviously taking pictures of a car share system. But then in Japan, in China, not everything is good. I was there recently, and the traffic jams are just insane. But they are trying to do the right things about it. Put the big roads on a lane diet. Take vehicle lanes away. This is for a BRT system in Guangzhou, which is the largest BRT system in the world. In fact, they do something of the order of 29,000 boardings per hour at peak rush hour, which is roughly the same size as any heavy rail-based system. They're platforms look very similar to rail platforms, but then they also are investing in conventional metro and, of course, high-speed rail. But in all of this, again, looking out for the littlest person, is it working for everyone, or is it only working for people who have the cars and the flashy things? So I think there is, in large parts of the world, there is this issue of smartness also being relevant to people that are the weakest. Okay, so resilience and climate change. I started a little late, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. If you want to stop me, you can stop me or ask me questions later. This is, of course, right after Sandy. It's a New York City Transit tunnel. This is the Metro North line. This is the Hudson line. This is the entrance to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. This is not even Sandy. It's in a storm event in 2007. And we have a tough audience. As you can see, that guy in the white shirt is completely oblivious to the water. He just wants his train to show up. And he's like cursing the MTA as to why the train is not there. But so we have, and actually events like this are much more going to be the norm and much more going to be what we'll have to deal with. And this is a visualization of Lower Manhattan with no surge, just a 2.5-foot sea level rise, and this is what it starts to look like. And so unless you want to go to work like this, you have to make the system more resilient. And we are working on that, and so are many other systems in wonderful ways. I don't have a lot of the resilience stuff to share with you because a lot of the resilience stuff is still kind of being, it moves very slowly through the system. So right now, the federal monies have come in, and we are just starting to make physical objects with them or put in portals. But in subsequent presentations, hopefully, I'll have a little bit more of this. This is a very interesting concept. This is in Tokyo, and under the metro, they have this incredibly large caverns where when the water comes into the tunnel, they can drain very quickly into these, and in the meanwhile, shut the doors. But resilience can also be less grand and very granular. This is the new orange line in Portland. They not only built this line, but they've actually made the whole thing green. And they planted in the right of way along the stations. And what would have been a commuter parking lot is now. So what they've thought of as the whole new orange line is a sink. So water from the neighborhood, stormwater from the neighborhood gathers and is captured in and then percolated down into the ground. So you can have resilience take very beautiful shape like this. So finally, my last section is kind of how to pay for all this. This time around, after Sandy, we've received federal monies. We'll hopefully receive a little more federal money, but that's thinking of resilience as a one-off thing. Resilience is not one-off. Climate resilience has to be ongoing because it's morphing, it's changing. And so one of the ways I think we can generate money is from this notion of transit avoided carbon. The fact that and you can actually look it up at transitavoidedcarbon.com. And this is work that we were a part of along with several other agencies. APTA had something called the Climate Change Working Group. And basically the three elements that we identified that you can actually measure using census data and so on. One is land use factor, what I was saying about Dallas, how places densify. When they built the Red Line in LA, everybody called it the subway from nowhere to nowhere. But you give it 30 years and somewhere gets up and moves to nowhere. Densification happens along the line, people start living there and moving and so on. So land use factor, land use changes. Mode shift, this is public transportation, shared platforms tend to be greener. And then congestion relief, which is a network benefit, that the network itself is lightened up when other would-be drivers are now commuters. And these three are our credit side, so land use, congestion relief, and mode share. And our debit side is what we emit from our own vehicles or from purchased electricity, etc. And if you do the math on that for us, for the MTA, we help avoid about 17 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. This is from last year. It varies a little bit based on ridership. And we put out about 2 million metric tons. And this is, I'm going to kind of rush through this, but basically, if you took 17 million metric tons and multiplied that by 30, which is kind of the rate at which a single metric ton of carbon trades in places like Germany and Japan, in which Waxman-Markey, which is the only bill in this country ever to have been actually written about climate change had a steady state pricing, then we are basically producing about $500 million, $500 million of an unrecognized and uncompensated value. And if this value could be captured, even in part, you could bond against it, you could build things, you could make the system more resilient, you could perhaps even lower fares, etc. More about this at mta.info/sustainability. And now, I'm going to end with just some conclusions, and after that, I'm actually going to end with a few pictures. But as societies develop and industrialize, their energy needs rise. This is the whole India, China. Transportation emerges as a major consumer of energy. I'm sorry the whole thing is screwed up, so I'll let the text stay for a little while. Automobile-based paradigm with corollary suburban sprawl is wasteful and unsustainable. Sustainable urban growth has to embrace mass transit and support density. Non-motorized transportation options have to be plentiful and inexpensive. This is the biking, walking, etc. And designing the right carbon-constrained system can generate resources to climate-proof transit. So just in the morning, I threw in a couple of additional images. People think the Pope is coming, and this is the subway riding Pope. This is the subterráneo in Buenos Aires, which he took all the time. And people think of him as being pro-poor because he rides the subway. Really? You have to be much more glamorous about subway riding. Hot people have to be riding the subway. I'm not saying the Pope is not hot, maybe he is, but it shouldn't be, this is the problem, because there's this great Onion article, and it's an Onion article. It says, Americans support public transportation for others. So that's the problem, right? I mean, and I'll at this point crack a terribly politically un-PC joke, and it's not even a joke. It's really really offensive, but it captures why public transportation is so poorly treated in this country. The Atlanta system is called MARTA, and this absolutely awful thing is that says MARTA stands for Moves African Americans Rapidly Through Atlanta. If everyone thought of if the train was, you hear of these great stories about some Scandinavian country where the queen rides the bicycle in the streets. Gustavo Petros, the Bogota mayor, said a rich country is not one where poor people drive cars, but where rich people take transit. So I think the paradigm has to be shifted. It's not that this pro-poor Pope takes the subway. It's everyone takes the subway because it's convenient, it's fast, it gets you from A to B without the hassle of sitting in traffic. It has to be cool. So anyway, the Pope should ride. I hope he rides the subway when he's in New York, but so should many other. And now this is absolutely the last series of images. So this was the 1950 image, right? This was the vision of utopia. 2 kids, dog, car, boat, suburban house. And this is what it turned the landscape into, just completely scarred it. Suburban sprawl, just took beautiful country and destroyed it. And we are fighting that last image with this image. And this is the wrong image to be fighting it with, because this image says, you can carry on with your life as you want on the demand side. We will solve the problem on the supply side. That's not right. The problem is a demand side problem. The demand is out of control. We have to work with the demand. We should still be doing this, but this is not the romantic image that we should be fighting that black and white image with. Instead, we should be fighting it with this, with people walking around, looking good, healthy. This image, typically, I kind of tailor to where the presentation is, but this is still in Shanghai, this is still in China, but I thought, why not? I mean, this is a universal, it speaks to everyone. So then people say, oh, this is very good, Shanghai is all fine, I sometimes have a Lisbon picture, etc. But they said, you're from New York, what's your vision of, is it Times Square? I said, no, it's not Times Square. I really think my vision is the New York City borough of Queens. But as you know, Queens is very not photogenic. It doesn't make for good pictures. So I thought maybe to sear that word, Queens, or Queen, in your head, maybe it's a better idea to show Freddie Mercury, or maybe a very young and at one point quite lissom Her Majesty inspecting her East African troops just as they're about to go kill the Mau Mau. But anyway, those are just to leave the impression in your head. But this is Queens. This is Jackson Heights. That was maybe 99%, maybe not actually, but this is certainly 1%. So it's a place with all sorts of people. This is the Steinway factory. There are blue collar jobs still in that borough, and everybody cheek by jowl and on the back of good public transportation. So that's it. That's my presentation. Do we have time for questions? Sure.
Questions? What are the people of Texas doing, for God's sake? Why is that so skewed?
So somebody said air conditioning, and I sort of want to take that on like straight away. It's not true. Air conditioning is not at fault, because Southern California also has a lot of air conditioning, and if you remember, that number is less than half of Texas. It is transportation. It is in the other two states that I showed, which is New York, has a population of 19 million, of whom 12 live in downstate, in and around the city. And almost all of them, so that's 2/3 of the state's population. It's not that the folks in Albany aren't driving cars, because I showed you a picture of Albany. They are driving cars. But 2/3, the center of gravity of the state transportationally is very public transportation oriented. Similarly, in California, it's not that the people in LA, well, now a lot of them are taking public transport, but traditionally, California was a driving state. But there's the Bay Area, and a lot of people in and around the Bay Area are taking public transportation every day, which is bringing the whole the state's thing down. But Texas does not have a population center that captures, a third or a quarter of its population, let alone 2/3, and then allows very good public transportation. This is hopefully not going to be the case forever, because both Houston and Dallas have they're rolling out public transportation programs. And both of those cities and others have a history of good public transportation, which was kind of upended in the middle of the century. So it's just lifestyle. It's not just air conditioning. It is a hot place, and climate control takes a lot of energy, but it's mostly getting around. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
And if I could just throw something in, I tried to shoot once and tried to walk and couldn't. I wanted to go from one building adjacent to another, and I couldn't do it. I had to go all the way down the right, and then onto the road, and down the road, and back up in order to do it. So the infrastructure system there was essentially mitigating against that type of problem. So you need to build that into this.
Correct.
Correct.
So I'd also like to ask a related question. So
Sure.
I don't mean to defend the Texans by any means, but the numbers you provided, does that include the industries in that state?
Yes, it's all in.
Okay. So if a lot of energy goes into producing energy, and the people in New York, for example, are using that energy, is that in New York's numbers?
That's a very good question. So essentially, I'll maybe even elaborate the question a little bit. So let's say a lot of New York's fuel is being refined in Texas. Then is it that disaggregated component stays behind and makes Texas look bad, whereas New York is, so lily white? Well, this is true, but in New York's specific case, the refining mostly happens in New Jersey. And so that is kind of the kernel of my answer to you. I don't have the New Jersey number up in mind. I cannot remember it off the top of my head. But New Jersey is a state, for instance, that does a lot of refining. But if you put New Jersey and Texas next to each other on a per capita, and New Jersey is also a fairly large state, even though it's a small state. But in these kinds of metrics, it has a significant presence. It would be much lower than Texas. So yes, Texas is doing some of the refining, if you will, for Oregon that looks a whole lot better. But no, it's not enough to explain that 476 million BTU number.
Okay, but to be perfectly fair to the Texans, it should really include the products which are manufactured in other locations that they are using, yeah?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is what you meant by the question, but the way I answer that question is, Texans are also benefiting from combustion that others undertake. So, for instance, in a completely global scale, we're all benefiting from combustion that is going on in China. So, let's say this particular podium that lectern that I'm standing at was, let's say, for argument's sake, made in China. It has absolutely no emission implication here other than some transportation related little things. And does that offshore this? And it does. And so Texans, by consuming, are also benefiting. Their number is going down because China is picking up some of those numbers. And there are analyses that try to take all of that into account. But in broad brushstrokes, the story that I'm telling is not, it does not become false. It is still at the end of the day, and you can, for instance, do this analysis by taking away a state like Texas. I just took it because it's one of three largest, and look at a state like, say, I don't know, Nevada or New Mexico, which does not have much of public transportation, but also does not have any refining. And they're still extremely high in terms of per capita energy consumption.
I think that's about all the time we have for questions for
Yes.
So if you have extra questions you'd like to ask while we get set up for the next panel?